Welcome to the Aquarium of the Pacific, everyone, for our first Wednesday lecture. We're really excited to have you here tonight, whether you're in the theater or watching online. Tonight's presentation, sorry, I should introduce myself. My name is Jenny. I have the pleasure of working for the Aquarium here as our Vice President of Education and Conservation, and tonight I also have the responsibility of being your host. So I'll have the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what to expect for this evening, help field question and answers, and then answer all your random questions after the program. What's my favorite animal? Where can I find steelhead here at the Aquarium of the Pacific? So tonight we are learning about a story of rescue and recovery. So the Palisades fire was very impactful to our community in many different ways, and this is one potentially bright spot out of that terrible, terrible event. You're going to have the opportunity to hear from 3 different speakers from 3 different groups that participated in this story of rescue. I'm going to introduce each of those speakers in turn because I think it gets a little muddy when we do it all together, knowing that they'll present for 8 minutes or so and then come back up. So you'll see me up here frequently. Before we get started with those presentations, though, I would love for us to thank our sponsors. We're able to be here in part tonight, not just because of your ticket purchase, but also some of the sponsors of the First Wednesday Lecture Series. That includes the Courtyard by Marriott Long Beach Hotel, the Osborne and Rourke Charitable Trust, and Stephen and Brenda Olson. So thank you so much for your support for these wonderful events. So let me tell you a little bit about our speakers tonight. I said we're talking about fish, we're talking about recovery in the wake of the Palisades fire, but our speakers are from different agencies. They include Rosi Dagit, Kyle Evans, and Dr. Brenton Spies. Our first speaker will be Rosi. So as I'm introducing Rosi, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. We want to make sure that everyone is fully present with our presentations this evening, and the cell phone calls can be a little bit disruptive. Rosi is going to really set the stage for us with her personal perspective of rescue in the Topanga Lagoon and other parts of the Santa Monica Mountains, and her colleagues Brenton and Kyle will provide a larger perspective on why these types of initiatives, recovery and restoration of these species, are so impactful. Now to meet Rosi. Rosi, a round of applause, please. Rosi Dagit is a conservation biologist with the Resource Conservation District of the Santa Monica Mountains. This is located in Topanga, California, if you're not already familiar. She has worked on conserving resources in the Santa Monica Mountains for more than 35 years. What a fantastic responsibility and opportunity to have with that. She has been looking at creeks monthly since 2001, looking for endangered southern steelhead trout, as well as doing monitoring of endangered tidewater gobies and other native fish in the Malibu Lagoon. This is really impactful not only to the Topanga area, but also Rosi has been involved in the LA River, and in particular with FOLAR, to understand what fish exist in the upper LA River and the connectivity between the different parts of the LA River. She works on habitat restoration in a lot of different forms and is currently the project manager for the Topanga Lagoon restoration planning process in collaboration with state parks. So let's give Rosi a wonderful aquarium welcome as she tells you more.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having us here tonight. And Aquarium of the Pacific, we're really grateful that you decided to share our story with your big audience. So I'd like to start by just, hold on, let's see if this, yes, it works. Just like to set the stage for those of you who aren't as familiar with this, the northern Santa Monica Bay. But this year, we had a really unusual thing happen. The Malibu Creek watershed, which is the second largest watershed that drains into the Santa Monica Bay, was burned in December of '24. And then in January, we had the Palisades fire, which burned the Topanga Creek watershed, which is the third largest watershed. And what's interesting is this is the first time in a very long time that both of the critical habitat for southern steelhead trout and endangered tidewater gobies were pretty much impacted simultaneously. So that meant that rescuing fish from one watershed meant that we couldn't put them in the neighboring watershed, which added a lot of complexity to what we were trying to do. And the thing that was really interesting about all this is that when you look at critical habitat and the impacts to it, really what you're thinking about is sediment, and how does the sediment move through the system. And the idea is that if you can get in fast enough, that you can get to the aquatic critters before the rains come and bring all that sediment down into the pools, you can make it work. Well, I've lived in the Topanga Creek watershed since I moved to California in 1987. And I've been a part of a LA County Sheriff volunteer group called Arson Watch. And one of the things about Arson Watch is that whenever there's a red flag day or a wildfire in progress, we get called and asked to help. And during the Palisades fire, what that meant is that I was driving around in the upper Topanga Creek watershed, watching the flames coming over the ridge lines and directing teams of volunteers to clear the roads, to put out spot fires, and to try to make the roads accessible for all these firemen who were coming from so far away. Let's see, it's not moving. There we go. But as we were leaving the canyon the first day, what we found was that already the creek was starting to be impacted. In this image, you can see the sediment, the ash, already accumulating on the surface of the water. And as soon as it does that, it decreases dissolved oxygen, and it makes it really hard for any fish that's living in the water to survive. So I knew that we really had to move fast. And down at Topanga Lagoon, it was equally as bad. So what was really the key here was partnerships and access. Because we work in partnership with Los Angeles County Department of Beaches and Harbors and state parks and Caltrans, they were able to get us into incident command, which this is some really scary views from Zuma Beach parking lot, where over 1,000 firefighters and ancillary staff were housed for most of the fire. And that's where incident command was. And it was a daunting thing to stand up in that venue and say, I need access, you've got to let us in. So even though the fire was still going on, our intrepid RCD team, some of whom are here tonight, we were able to get in and go down to Topanga Lagoon and start collecting water quality to see what the conditions were. And it was not good. But fortunately, we also had partnerships with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Dr. Brenton Spies and other groups. And the first thing that we needed to do was get the gobies out, because the sediment was coming and it was coming fast. So on the 17th of January, the crew assembled, and it was kind of all hands on deck. And we were not sure we were going to be able to get the gobies because the lagoon had breached due to all the excess water from the firefighting. But we were able to catch 760 gobies, which was amazing. We put them all in coolers, and in the back of Brenton's truck, in the back of my truck, we went on a road trip and took them to the Heel to Bay Aquarium at the Santa Monica Pier, and also down here to the Aquarium of the Pacific. And what was really astonishing was how well the aquariums had prepared to receive these fish. And none of these aquariums take care of these fish generally. They're sort of a brackish water species. But all this teamwork really pulled together, and it was an amazing thing to watch. The steelhead were a little bit more complicated, because when you have 4,000 meters of stream that we knew there were over 500 individuals in, distributed throughout, how do you go in and effectively capture them? And what we realized was we needed to call in every fish favor we had, and Kyle, who you'll hear from momentarily, all of us just talked to everyone we knew, and people from Santa Barbara and San Diego all came up to Topanga. They had to be there by 7 in the morning because we only had a window of an hour for the state park rangers to escort us into the closed road area. And when we got there, we broke up into 4 teams with electrofishing and netters and bucket carriers who were essential because it's kind of hard to see in these images, but it was really steep. And we had to bucket brigade the fish up the hills to where the trucks were waiting on the road. And those trucks we put all together and carried all the fish. At the end of the day, everybody was really, really tired, covered with soot, but it was such a satisfying feeling to feel like we actually did something to save these fish. And I have to give a big shout out to the Fillmore Hatchery. They haven't had as much experience in hosting wild fish, and they really did their best to accommodate these fish and to make them feel comfortable. Unfortunately, the wild fish, after their alien abduction from the creek, being put in trucks and taken to the hatchery, were not super happy in the hatchery. So we realized that we needed to get them back out into the wild as quickly as we could. And what was our gain, but a previous loss, was Arroyo Hondo Creek up in the Central Coast area near Gaviota. They had had a fire in 2021 that wiped out their entire watershed and their population of steelhead. So there were no fish left in their creek, but the habitat had recovered from all of our good rains. So once again, the bucket brigades began. And here I have to give a tremendous amount of credit to the CDFW watershed stewards and our RCD team, because it was a good 1.5 miles of carrying 5-gallon buckets full of fish, very precious cargo, up that watershed to get them back. But we did it. And what's really amazing is that despite all that work, we couldn't bring them back to Topanga, because this is what Topanga looks like. The habitat is pretty much like a bowling alley for the entire reach of the stream. There are no pools left anymore. The pools that were 12 feet deep are now covered, and I can walk across them. But the fish, to our great amazement, actually reproduced and spawned in the creek. And so in a couple years, when things get better, we're hoping that we'll be able to bring the Topanga trout back home to Topanga. But in the meantime, down in the lagoon, things got really interesting, because we went from having an open connection, and it was closed finally in June. And what that meant is that the water level rose in the lagoon. And so on the 17th of June, 6 months to the day, we were able to bring all the gobies back to Topanga Lagoon and put them back in their home, which is a pretty satisfying thing. So I'd just like to conclude by saying that I learned a couple of really important lessons in doing this. Margaret Mead once said that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it is the only thing that ever has. And I really feel that the collaborations, the cooperation, the shared goal of trying to keep this immensely important gem of genetic biodiversity going was what motivated everybody to work together to pull this off. And it takes a team. But it also takes some individuals who have the gumption and say, this is what we got to do. And so my hope for you tonight is to think about what it is that you can do in your world, in whatever way, where you feel like you can make a difference, because we all have that goal and that need after such a big event like this, and in fact, in response to all the upheaval that's happening in our world in general. And so find your way and find a way to do some good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosie, so much for that introduction and personal journey of this wonderful partnership to save fish. Our second presenter is Dr. Brenton Spies, who is an associate teaching professor at the Environmental Science and Resource Management Department of CSU Channel Islands. There, he specializes in topics such as conservation biology, restoration ecology, and endangered species work. He particularly likes to focus on California and coastal aquatic ecosystems and disaster response, hence tonight's lecture, habitat restoration and species protection. Following the Palisades fire, he's going to be talking about the response that he helped multi-agency and other partners come together to recover tidewater gobies. And it's important to mention again that he's an educator, so while he's in the classroom, he really is making sure that students are mentored such that they could be the next generation of conservation scientists, which resonates with me as an educator here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. So let's give Dr. Spies a warm welcome to the podium.
Topic. I want everyone to just appreciate this whale of a shark goby right here. It looks massive here, but I assure you that these gobies are quite small. And so this is the largest tidewater goby that's on record. It's just over about 2.5 inches. That's my hand. So they're really, really small. This is a beautiful gravid female, so she probably has about 800 or 1,000 eggs in her right now. I'm frequently asked, this is a really small fish. Why do we care? Why do we want to conserve this fish? We don't get to eat it. It's probably not something that you're going to interact with much of your life. But this fish has a massive impact on our coastal ecosystems throughout the California coast, particularly these coastal lagoons and wetland habitats. So this is one of my favorite places. This is Schumann Creek in Vandenberg Air Force Base. This is what California used to look like before European colonization, about 150 years ago. And there's one fish, really, throughout California that has adapted to be able to survive and really thrive in these types of ecosystems. They're very dynamic ecosystems, and that's the tidewater goby. These systems, for a period of the year, are when they're closed off, so you see that this habitat has a sandbar. They're going to be fresh water or brackish water, and then they'll go through periods of transition when they're connected to the ocean, and they'll be saline. They'll be, the salinity of the ocean, sometimes even more. They could be upwards of like salton sea salinities in some habitats. They're extremely resilient. They can deal with variations in temperature and salinity and pH and dissolved oxygen, which we usually don't find in most fish. They're truly the backbone or the anchor of these ecosystems. And so you have this really diverse food web, depends on which locations you go to, but there's tons of birds and fish, including steelhead that eat the tidewater goby, and then it regulates a lot of the insects and invertebrates that are found in here, including mosquitoes. They love mosquito larvae. So they really are the anchor for the health and the function of these ecosystems, these coastal wetland ecosystems. I say tidewater gobies, there's actually 2 species. And so when it was listed under the Endangered Species Act in '94, it was considered 1 species. We found that it's actually 2 now. So I'm just going to focus on the northern tidewater goby, which actually does come into Southern California, but particularly, oops, I pushed the wrong button. We're going to focus on the LA Ventura County because that's where these impacts of the fires happen. Tidewater gobies are managed slightly differently than most endangered species, which individuals are the management unit. So like, one sea otter is really important, and one California condor or mountain lion is really important. Tidewater gobies don't live very long. They live less than a year. So we manage them on a population scale, and a population is one individual lagoon or site, wetland. And so this is Topanga Canyon. This is a really small lagoon compared to a lot of other sites that you found. And so this is where the Palisades fire came through, and this is pre-fire. You can see that this is a really small lagoon. It's impacted by urbanization, which many of these sites are throughout the coast. And after the fire hits, this is one of the sites that, there's this acute impact of the fire now impacting all the way down to the beach, right? So it's burning the habitat. And you can see that the water, it's a little hard to see in here, but the water is a little murky. There's not a lot of debris in here. We actually got lucky on this fire because we had a little pre-flush. All the water that was used to fight the fire came into the watershed and actually breached the sandbar about a day or two before we did our rescue. And so a lot of that initial ash and sediment and debris got flushed out, which is not always the case. And so we were able to respond really quickly to this rescue because we learned a lot from the Thomas Fire and the Woolsey Fire. This is Rincon Creek. So for those of you that remember, the Thomas Fire happened in December of 2017. And so going into March of the following year, the system still hadn't breached yet. So all that fire debris, all that fire retardant or the Phos-Chek, all the ash was just accumulated in these lagoons for months, right? And it essentially suffocated the tidewater gobies. And so we had a lot of local extinctions that occurred in various sites. One was Rincon, another one was Carpinteria Creek. This site had full electrical poles and power lines and everything in the system. So even if we wanted to go in and rescue them, we couldn't. There'd be no way that we could actually pull a net and collect any gobies. But we learned a lot about what happens to these lagoons after a fire happens. Some sites, this is Arroyo Perdon. This is a really important site for tidewater gobies that was impacted, and we had local extinctions. We still haven't had them return yet. Carpinteria Creek and Rincon, it took 6 years for them to naturally come back. And so now that we're learning a lot of these impacts and how they're influencing the populations, we're able to respond a lot more quickly when we have these emergency situations like we had with the Palisades fire. And so here's another photo of Arroyo Perdon. And so we were able to respond. We're really lucky. I work with the tidewater goby throughout the California coast. It's really hard. Every single site, every single region has different types of management strategies. And so we're really lucky. Rosi and I are part of a tidewater goby working group where we work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and state and federal agencies to come up with plans for our region. So that's LA County and Ventura County. We don't have those for the rest of the coast yet. And so we're working on that. But we're using all of these tools and all of this knowledge that we've been accruing from all these fires to kind of come up with these game plans so we can share them throughout the coast to different agencies. So next time there is a fire, because there will be a next time, they're increasing, right? They're getting more and more intense and more frequent. We can respond a lot quicker, and we know the resources that are needed to do so. What is needed going forward is difficult, right? We have a lot of adaptive management strategies for tidewater gobies. Every region's different. Some regions are heavily impacted by drought. Some of them, when we have our El Nino flooding events, those like in Petaluma and Santa Cruz, those are what we manage for. Most of the coast has non-native predators, so we're constantly managing those. It's a cycle of things that we have to constantly manage in order to make sure that these populations stay healthy and preserved for the future. Now we have to start building in wildfire, right? That's not something when I started working on gobies 15 years ago that I thought we were gonna have to start building into, but we do now. And so what does that mean? The biggest thing for us is getting out and doing monitoring. So if we go 4 or 5 years without monitoring, we don't actually know the status of those gobies when a fire impacts. And so I've been trying to build our program at Kelsey Channel Islands. Actually, John is here in the house today. So we have some of our students that are now learning, part of their conservation classes, are actually going out in the field and learning conservation by doing. And so we're taking a lot of the Ventura, Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo coast and actively monitoring it so we know the current status of them. But the most important thing is building our partnerships with our aquariums. It's really easy for us to go out and pull nets and collect gobies and put them into a ice chest and drive them somewhere. Where do we drive them to? And so that's the hard part, right? We have great working relationships with Aquarium of the Pacific, Gila Bay, the Birch Aquarium. But what happens when there's a fire in San Francisco Bay or in the Central Coast? We don't have those yet. And so that's the critical part because we might have some holding facilities, but really the aquariums are the ones that get them from point, that initial stage. So for us, it was January 17th all the way to June 17th, right? The animal care is what's really needed so we can return them back healthy. So that's the big part that we're building, and that's needed in order to kind of advance our wildfire management. So with that, I want to thank everybody that was a part of this. Another huge goby photo. And yeah, thank you so much.
There we go, I can do technology. Thanks, Brenton, for that presentation. Our third and final presentation this evening will be given by Kyle Evans. He's a program manager for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and oversees that agency's anadromous, I always mess that word up the first try, anadromous and inland fishery programs throughout Southern California. In this role, he and his team do independent fisheries research, population and habitat monitoring, fish rescues, and habitat restoration within 5 coastal counties of Southern California. Prior to this role, he was the lead steelhead biologist for CDFW, and he has been working in these streams in and around Southern California since 2012. So I welcome Kyle up to continue the story. Let's give him a round of applause.
taking a small segment of that and basically moving them to a new habitat in a new area. So we're starting this new population further upstream. It's above the Big Tahunga Dam. And this is one where it has to be kind of a multi-year process just because we're dealing with such a small imperiled population, but it's also been seeing some major successes. Most recently, we saw a lot of young of the year spawned out Santa Ana sucker. So again, another, a different use of translocations, but kind of that same end goal. Those are certainly some of our short-term solutions and our but really, one thing we are trying to focus on, and we really need to focus on, is those kind of long-term goals. And that is going to include really a lot of habitat restoration. When you have fish on the landscape and there is a wildfire, something like this, one problem we run into is we think, well, where can we put them? We need more high-quality habitat. We need other areas that aren't already occupied by fish. So we're really trying to focus on a lot of our barrier removals, our habitat restoration, particularly for salmon and trout, right? As we have everything from these large projects like the Matilaha Dam or the Ringe Dam in Malibu, down to even smaller barriers and debris basins. And long-term, removing these barriers, restoring this habitat, and removing invasive species that are either going to compete with or predate on or impact the stream or quality in some way, are going to give these opportunity or give these fish the opportunities to really survive and thrive on the landscape. I included as well, we've got some baby catfish, and then always our favorite American bullfrog, who's very picturesque. We're also looking at, not just some of these removing big barriers, which are really important, but also kind of renaturalizing some of our streams. And that can be a little hard to do in Southern California, but we're looking at ways to kind of reconnect the floodplain, really spread that water out, slow it down, let it soak in, create some kind of complexity. And there's some fun new science and ideas about using this kind of process-based restoration. That I think is really a big opportunity because it's something that can be done with volunteers and with guides and for relatively cheap amounts of money compared to some of your major big dam removals. And then one of the last components I'll talk about that we're focused on really is this aspect of monitoring, because it's really difficult for us to know, okay, where these populations are, but also how are they doing? Is the restoration working? Are there things that we should be focusing on or other limiting factors? So really getting out on the landscape and kind of trying to keep an eye on everything as much as we can is really a critical component. So with that, I wanted to just throw a giant picture of a steelhead from Santa Barbara County. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you, Kyle. We're going to invite the other previous speakers, Rosi and Brenton, up onto the stage, and we're now going to do a moderated Q&A. So what that means is you, the audience, have an opportunity to ask some of those burning questions that you might have that weren't answered in the presentations or what sparked your interests. So 2 lovely aquarium volunteers are going to be walking up and down the aisles with a microphone. If you have interest, go back to your elementary school days, raise your hand, and the microphone will make its way to you. Perfect. We have our first question in that front row.
Thank you very much for your joint talk. I have a question about the gobies. What an interesting creature. You mentioned some of the tidewater environments they live in have gone sterile, and then they regenerate. How do they regenerate? Do they migrate, or do you seed them?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I didn't go into detail due to time, but the adults disperse. So the larvae of gobies can't actually handle the ocean, the salinity, so they kind of need it to be stable. The adults are the really resilient ones. So they can go from fresh water, and then these lagoons will breach during like the first major storm. It's massive. Sometimes like when large systems like the Santa Clara River breach, the cloud of sediment goes all the way to the islands, right? So it pushes everything out. And those gobies are, they're on a big water slide and they're shooting out to the ocean. and then they'll make their way into the next habitat. The thing that makes it difficult, especially for Southern California, is that which habitats do they go to? Because we've built on most of them, right? We've developed on most of them. So if you go to the Santa Cruz coast, there's sites all over the place. They can just go into the nearby site. In Los Angeles County, unfortunately, there's not many where they can go. So it's a lot harder for them to rejuvenate a population. Yeah.
What's kind of funny is that we know that the gobies that came to Topanga were originally from Malibu. And that's about 9 kilometers as the goby swims to come from Malibu to make it to the mouth of Topanga. So when you think about the survival of this little itty bitty guy, making it all the way, that's pretty cool.
We've documented them going 15 kilometers, so they can go a long ways.
Yeah.
It's pretty incredible.
Up at the top.
It seems like.
I think we need to turn on your microphone. There's usually a slide button.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. It seems like that you are in a restoration recovery mode. What markers are you looking for that would establish that you've been successful in the species being self-sustaining?
What a great question.
Is that clear?
Yeah,
Why don't you take that?
yeah, absolutely it is. Yeah, it's a great question. Within Southern California, steelhead, rainbow trout, we are looking for a few different things. We talk about having fish in good condition, and by that we're talking about the condition at a individual level. So is the fish itself healthy? Is it eating? Does it have parasites or lesions? We're talking about it at a population level. So are you seeing a high density of fish within a certain area, and are you seeing them in multiple stages of their life history? So multiple size classes. Are you seeing young ones? Are you seeing old ones, anadromous ones, ones that are smolting and going out? And then we're also looking at a community level because we're trying to see, is the river or the system itself healthy and operating the way it's supposed to be? And is it supporting not just steelhead, but the entire food chain and other species that are there? Steelhead themselves, I refer to them as a indicator species because their life history is very complex and they do use every aspect of the watershed and of the water cycle. So if you have a functioning, or if you have a large population of steelhead, that pretty much means that you have a naturally functioning kind of operating watershed or river.
I just want to add that one of the things that was really interesting is that in the Santa Monica Bay, what we saw was the colonization and establishment of these populations in Malibu in '95 for the gobies, 2001 in Topanga for the gobies, 2001 for the steelhead in Topanga. And we watched the whole process of them establishing, colonizing, and spreading themselves out. And then we were faced with this extirpation. So that whole cycle of restoration to extirpation has worked itself out within a 30-year time frame, which is kind of an amazing thing. And because of the rescues, and because of that preservation of the genetic biodiversity represented by those individual populations, we're going to be able to reboot the system, if you will, and get it going again, which is an amazing thing. How lucky are we that we were able to do that, you know?
We have one down here.
Hello, thank you so much for being here and for all your insight. This was amazing. So you all mentioned how these natural disasters are only increasing as we see across like not only our state, but the country and the world. Has there been any policy or legislation in our state, whether on the city level or state level, in regards to the destruction of ecosystems from wildfires and natural disasters?
That's a great question. I do not know the answer to that. I don't know of any policies that have been coming up. I think there's There's some that are working on different types of management strategies for fire, which I think the state of California needs, but I don't think there's been any policies in place. I personally we don't enforce policies or any of that stuff. We basically are informing those that make the policies to have the on the ground kind of information that they need of how these natural disasters, and we've been having a lot of wildfires, right? That's the hot topic that has happened recently. But before that, we had a very prolonged drought, which was essentially a natural disaster for a lot of these gobies and amphibians and things like that. El Nino floodings, we're having more and more frequency of El Nino events, so these things are flooding a lot more than we typically. So these are all things that are happening that we can provide the information. The policy side is a different story, especially in the world that we're living in today.
But we do have the 30 by 30.
Yep.
So on a statewide level, there is the 30 by 30 legislation, which is really trying to recognize the importance of what Kyle brought up, which is the big picture long term. We've got to create enough sustainable habitat so that we can have redundancy of populations across the landscape and not be so distraught when we're losing any particular one of them. That we've got enough eggs in our basket that we can know that things will continue. So that's the only policy I'm aware of. Do you know of any others?
Yeah, I'm trying to think, there are some initiatives around the state, and we talk about like the FireWise program, looking at home hardening and creating defensible space. We do work with a lot of the other agencies when they are either conducting the firefighting operations themselves. We're working with CAL FIRE and how they develop their fire management plans and their mitigation strategies of how can you try and protect the landscape, but also doing the least amount of biological or ecological damage. In the past, National Marine Fisheries Service and the department have worked with CAL FIRE, and like when it comes to that fire retardant Phos-Chek that was mentioned earlier, trying to get them to not drop it in the creek if they can avoid that, just because really it does a huge number on anything that's living there. So we're kind of doing some of that behind the scenes work, or after the fire, for example, with the Palisades recovery, is the department had a biologist basically assigned within the their incident command, right? And basically their whole job was they would sit there and people say, hey, we're gonna go do X, Y, Z. And they'd say, okay, well, maybe could you do it this way? Or could you not push that this section? Or don't put that in the creek. So we're just trying to be there and provide that kind of expertise or support that those other agencies might not have.
At the very top of the theater.
Hello. So I got a question about the conservation efforts going towards, I think it was said ecological havens. Is that what it was? Is that like an active conversation where people can like go out there and volunteer and help out with their own personal expertise, or is that like kind of ordained by you guys and more structured with you guys?
So is the question about whether and how to volunteer?
It's like how to volunteer and whether or not it's an active conversation of doing to improve on it.
Yes, please. Everyone come. The RCD of the Santa Monica Mountains, the majority of the work that we do, we have a small staff, some of whom are here tonight and do an amazing job, but we couldn't do most of the work that we do without volunteers. And so I would encourage you, all of you, wherever you live, there are places like the RCDs that have volunteer efforts that you can participate in. And they're all different, they come in all different sizes and flavors, but they all make a difference. So yes, and yes.
Where do we like sign up for stuff like that?
So the Resource Conservation District of the Santa Monica Mountains has a website, and if you go to that website, there's a big button that says volunteer, and if you click that, it will get you to us. Please do.
Awesome, thank you.
There's other, I work a lot with the National Park Service in the Santa Monica Mountains that overlaps. RCD is great, they have tons of opportunities. The National Park Service also has a huge need, and they don't actually have, even before a lot of the budget cuts, they don't have the resources to do a lot of these restoration efforts. They heavily rely on volunteers. So you can go out in the national parks or like SAMO Fund, Santa Monica Mountains Fund, and they have like milkweed events and oak tree surveys, and you can actually be part of surveying and collecting data, but you could also be part of restoration efforts too. There's tons of opportunities.
And down here in Long Beach, if you are local, the Friends of the LA River, we do our fish surveys down here every now and again, and it's totally volunteer folks who come and help us. So Friends of the Los Angeles River is another great place, and Aquarium of the Pacific, I was just going to say. Go for it, Jenny.
Sure, yeah. So we don't have tidewater goby habitat restoration, but there are a lot of other ways to get involved in local habitats or community science more broadly, monitoring initiatives, and we have a website too for those. Or you can talk with me or somebody else in a blue shirt tonight, and they'd be happy to tell you about it. Thanks for the shout out. Yeah. I think we have a question down here, maybe in the third row.
Steve Lankenau, Long Beach Casting Club. We just celebrated our 100th year, and we have over 500 members. If there's ever a need for volunteers, we're more than helpful. We're always any kind of fish restoration, anything. We're here.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, we've, if we exchange some information after,
Definitely.
The department as well, I'm never going to turn down having some great involvement in volunteers. We do surveys or rescues, or even just having more eyes on the landscape. That's citizen science. A lot of times we'll have people say, hey, I think I saw a steelhead in this creek. We don't happen to be there. But as far as the casting club goes, we're doing surveys up in Arroyo Seco, Big Santa Anita, the West Fork and East Fork of the San Gabriels, that kind of stuff.
Right.
Okay, over in the center.
Hi, thank you for the talks. I was wondering, the ecosystems have always been on fire, I feel like in California in the past. How have the goby been resilient in the past, and are those resilient programs no longer effective in the modern urban life or age?
So I think it's a great question. There's definitely been fires, and fire management has changed, like the way that California particularly manages their fires over the last 100 years or so has changed a lot of how those gobies have had to adapt, right? They adapted to a different world for thousands of years where you had natural fires, to now we have, especially the ones that are been the most impactful, Woolsey Fire, Thomas Fire. There was a Tomahawk Fire that was down in Camp Pendleton that was pretty impactful. And then now the Palisades, you're having more urban fires, right? So now they're coming into the urban communities, and they're a lot more intense, right? And so when you would naturally have a lot of just vegetation debris going in and maybe some trees that would come through naturally and flush out, that's one thing. Now we're having infrastructure that's coming through and burning, and you're having metals, trace metals, arsenic, right, leads, contaminants. In addition to, we have altered these lagoon habitats, right? That Topanga Canyon wasn't that narrow before. Before all those fires happened 150 years ago, it was much more of an expansive wetland, and it could handle a fire. Now everything goes through this small little channel under a bridge, and it gets stuck there, right? So now it's where we have to jump in and we have to start mitigating it, because the impacts are so great, right? It's going to end up sitting there for months and months and months, which naturally, it probably wouldn't have done that. So I think that's kind of what's changed. And the goby hasn't adapted to that yet, right? That I don't think it'll probably ever adapt to that. Yeah, good question.
We have time for 2 more questions. Down here low.
Hi. So I noticed in the last presentation you were showing beavers, and I don't know if any of you are familiar, I know you're very into fish, but have there been any efforts to like bring in like other species, whether it be other fish species or like animals of different genres isn't the word, but other animals, and like, has that been happening, or are there plans for that, and how does that actually like contribute and support like the marine life or their aquatic life that lives in these like lagoons and stuff?
Kyle, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a great question. These are things that are all kind of tools in our toolbox when it comes to management of some of these habitats and the species. We have done in the past as a department, we've been around for a very long time, and there was a lot of taking species, and particularly game species and things like this, and just planting them across the landscape. And some of those impacts and ramifications we're still dealing with today. So as we're approaching it in the future, there is much more of a focus on the potential impacts, the potential benefits, and there is a lot of that focus on how can we restore what kind of naturally was there or was part of its natural historic range. For example, within the state, we do have a beaver translocation program that we started a couple years ago, and we've been going to a couple different sites and areas around the state that were part of their natural historic range and doing these reintroductions, potentially going in and kind of setting up the landscape first with some of these beaver dam analogs or post-assisted log structures so that when you put a beaver there, they kind of have the best head start. There are a few different programs. We're trying to do it a little more scientifically now than, say, we did in maybe 1920. But yeah, it really does depend on where you are and the location.
And then, do we have a final question?
Yes.
Okay, here we go.
Thank you, Kyle and Rosi and Brenton, for the work that you do. It's not appreciated enough, and I'm grateful for it. Watching what the federal government is doing to funding to the work that you're doing, what can we as people in this community do to help financially contribute to your work so that you can keep doing it?
So find your favorite nonprofit and give them a hand. Aquarium of the Pacific, the RCD of the Santa Monica Mountains, all of the different groups that are out there working really hard to try to repair damage on the landscape as much as we can. And so everyone should probably find whatever niche it is that is most meaningful for you. Because yes, everything is kind of unraveling all around us in the environmental world at the moment. And there's not a lot of respect for the many, many, many benefits that we all get from public lands and having healthy public ecosystems. So whatever you can do on that, please do. Thank you.
I think a little bit goes a long ways with a lot of these efforts. So even for me, doing tidewater goby work, a lot of what I do, I volunteer my time, and it's most of and whatever funds I get go to my students, so I can get students out there. I can pay maybe for them to have an internship over the summer, or it even just pays for gas for us to drive up to San Luis Obispo to pull nets in. And so even $50, $100, whatever to your favorite nonprofit. I tell my students a lot, like, this isn't, even though there's a lot going on right now, this isn't the first time that we've had defunding and the federal agencies have gone through these types of firings and reductions. And those are usually when the nonprofits have an uprising. So that's where a lot of the nonprofits, every single one of you donating to your nonprofits or volunteering for your nonprofits, that's usually when they start getting an increase in what they're able to do. And this is the time to do that, right? That's kind of what we have to rely on now. So.
Yeah.
That is an uplifting message to end on. I have, well, first let's do another round of applause for our wonderful trio. I have a couple of reminders for the rest of your time here at the aquarium. If you're not watching online, we do have a cocktail reception where you have the opportunity to ask some of those questions that you weren't able to on microphone. There's also a craft and a cash bar for you to partake in until 9 o'clock. I ask that you descend to this stage level to experience those things as well as to exit if you need to be on your way. We want you to come back. This is a monthly lecture series. So in August, we will be featuring Patrick Coyne, who does bioluminescent photography. So you'll see some gorgeous photos, I would venture to guess, as well as potentially get some techniques for how to get out there and take those photos yourselves the next time we have one of those blooms. So thank you so much. And we're passing out trading cards again tonight. So as you exit, you have the opportunity to expand your collection. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, everyone. We did it.